ready to go?
Yes.
All right. So, welcome back to another episode of Wonky Weekly.
I'm Rashaan James II.
And I'm Sid Solomon. We're gonna wonk our way to Wonky Town.
Still no.
I'm gonna. My wife just slammed the door. So, hi, Rashaan.
Hi, Sid.
We're in the same place.
Yeah, it's crazy.
It's crazy. It's so weird. This is reminiscent of when we used to sit next to each other in council meetings.
Our radio show.
This is what we did. There used to be, all the way back in 2016, we would sit at our seats and there would be microphones right in front of us that we would use when we spoke from our seats, which we weren't supposed to do anyway.
Only in the board meeting.
Only in the board meetings. But Rashaan and I would sit next to each other, and while everyone was eating their food pre-meeting, we would lean really closely into the microphones and we'd start narrating radio plays that only the people calling it on the phone could hear. And every once in a while we'd get a text from Ruth Kramer being like, "What are you doing? Why is this happening?
Why can we hear Rashaan and Sid's conversation?"
This is just so weird. Just like very closely leaning into the mic. We're nerds. Anyway.
Yeah.
So hi. Yes, I did get a final answer back on participation in committees and communities and action teams.
So did I.
Great, regarding conflict of interest. What did you hear? Let's see if they're the same thing.
I heard that you cannot be in conflict of interest in order to be in one of the communities.
Yes, and I heard the same thing about action teams. So essentially, anybody who wants to participate in a committee, a community, or an action team needs to fill out the union's conflict of interest form and say that you are not in conflict of interest. So it only took us 3 weeks, but we got a definitive answer. But we will only tell you information if we are fairly certain that it's true, right? All right. I'm glad we got that out of the way. What are we talking about today?
We are talking about contracts and contract ratification.
We're talking about contracts and contract ratification. This is as wonky as it gets.
Wonky, nerdy.
I think. So when you say contract, what do you mean? Contract can mean so many things in these contexts.
So not the thing that we necessarily sign. Mm-hmm. But the thing that is negotiated between the union and employers. Okay,
so essentially a collective bargaining agreement.
Yes, what we call a CBA.
So it's an agreement between a union and a group of workers, the representative of a group of workers, and an employer or group of employers. But essentially, a collective bargaining agreement with equity is what defines an equity theater. You become an equity theater when you have a collective bargaining agreement with the union. So how many CBAs does equity have with employers, both groups of employers and individual employers?
My guess,
hundreds. So many different CBAs. So let's talk about some of them and how they work at equity, but also how they work sort of across the labor movement, and the ways in which equity does things very similarly to most other unions, and some of the ways in which we are very, very different. So where should we start? Pick a CBA. Pick your favorite. What's your favorite CBA?
So I actually just became co-chair of the stock committee.
The stock committee.
So let's use cost.
Cost. Okay. The cost agreement. So what does cost stand for? Can I remember?
Council of Stock Theaters.
I think that's right. Yeah. Council of Stock Theaters. So the Council of Stock Theaters is what's called a multi-employer group. It's a group of employers, and they have collectivized, much like we as a union have collectivized. And why does anybody collectivize? To increase your power. Yeah, to get leverage. So workers have more leverage at the bargaining table when there's a group of us. It's not just, just me or just Rashaan, it's a bunch of us. And then we go and talk to an employer or employers, and we have more leverage together than we would individually. Same thing goes for employers. Sometimes employers join together and form multi-employer groups so that when they bargain with unions, they have more power. So the Council of Stock Theaters is one of them. Who I honestly don't know who's in the Council of Stock Theaters.
Oh man, see, sometimes I get confused between Corst and cost.
How could you possibly get cost and Corst, which is the Council of Resident Stock Theaters? How could you possibly get those two things confused? Okay, so name some stock theaters, some that are in cost and Corst.
So
and then we have
Paper Mill, North Shore.
Williamstown is Corst.
Williamstown is Corst.
Right. We could look this up, but it's more fun if we just guess and get them wrong. We might get some things wrong. St. Michael's is a stock theater.
St. Michael's Playhouse, yes.
Right.
Flat Rock.
I've never worked a stock contract of any kind. I've never done stock of any kind. So what defines a stock theater is generally?
So stock is usually a short term during the summer-ish. And, some theaters have branched out a little bit. Short rehearsal process, short short runs.
Okay.
And the theater size, it ranges from 100 seats to huge.
So from a worker's perspective, from the stage managers and actors who work stock theaters, why would you say it can be beneficial to our members to have contracts that specifically address the needs of working in stock theaters?
Something that happens a lot in stock that might not necessarily happen in another contract would be like running in rep, or having rehearsal for one show while you're doing a different show at night. Okay. So we need rules that protect the members from those things that are specific to the stock contract.
Okay. From an employer's perspective, and you've been on negotiating teams have you negotiated both of these contracts?
I've negotiated all of the stock contracts. Yeah, all of them.
Fancy, Rashaan. From what you can tell us from an employer's perspective, what are some things that stock theaters might be seeking from their side to get into our CBAs that perhaps we might not expect to hear from non-stock theaters?
Definitely, like, what would it cost for your members to work during the day of a show?
Gotcha.
For a rehearsal for a different show than the show that they're doing at night.
Okay. Getting up to the bargaining table, equity through its own processes that I'm sure we will devote an entire show to in the future. Equity comes to the table with a list of desires, a list of goals going into that negotiation. The Council of Stock Theaters sends their representatives to the bargaining table with their own set of goals. We negotiate. We sit at the table and both sides go back and forth. Now, I have pulled up, I've got sitting here on my lap, you can't see it, but I've got it here on my laptop. I've pulled up the website for the National Labor Relations Board, which you can find at nlrb.gov. I bet I can figure out those titles on the bottom of the screen again. And I've got them up because there are rules. There are rules in federal law defining how employers and unions have to deal with each other at the bargaining table when they are engaged in this act of bargaining. And can you just read that very first part of that first sentence, or just read that whole first sentence right there?
A union must bargain in good faith on behalf of employees it represents, and is unlawful for a union to fail to do so.
A union must bargain in good faith with its employer during during negotiations. Have to do it. Bargaining in good faith is a requirement. Let's pull up this next page. I'll read this one. Employers have a legal duty to bargain in good faith with their employees' representative and to sign any collective bargaining agreement that has been reached. So there is symmetrical responsibility and legal duty to bargain in good faith at the bargaining table. The recognition clause that can be found in Equity's CBAs defines that relationship. Equity is the representative of the employees. The employers are the employers, and whether it's them individually or collectively, like cost, we all come to the table and we have to bargain in good faith. Give me an example of a way in which the duty to bargain in good faith has affected the way that things go at the table.
You can't just say no.
Okay.
You can't just say no to all of it, at least. So if we come with 20 proposals, and the proposals are the things that we want. Mm-hmm. So both sides will have them and both sides bring them to the table. You can't just say no and absolutely stand in one place. It's like playing a game of chess. So you have to at all times be able to move one of the chess pieces.
Sure.
At no point can you say, well, I'm not going to move my chess piece.
Mm-hmm. A chess game where you're generally moving towards each other all the time and then eventually hitting somewhere near the center, but hopefully somebody's winning and hopefully we're winning.
And hopefully it's us.
Hopefully it's us. Yeah, not hopefully somebody's winning. Hopefully we're winning.
Exactly.
Hopefully the workers are winning. We're union people. Damn it. So, okay. So negotiating with cost. We have our proposals. They have their proposals. We come to the bargaining table. The bargaining table requires that we bargain in good faith. We adjust, they adjust, we go back and forth, we come to terms, shake hands at the table. Is that the end of the process?
No.
No. So when you shake hands at the table, you are entering into a tentative agreement.
Correct.
Because what's the last thing, at least from the union side, what's the last thing that we have to do?
We have to ratify.
We have to ratify. I got really excited about ratification.
He's wonky.
Okay, so ratification. Ratification is something across the labor movement, is something that happens, which essentially means the members of the union give you assent. They say, okay, the terms that you reached are good. and we will accept them, and they are okay with us, the members. So when do we send out the ratification for cost to the members of the union? How does that, is that by mail, or we do that by email? How does everybody get a?
Actually, that's not the way that cost goes. So cost, the shake hand contract
Yeah.
goes to the committee, which
Yeah.
would be the stock committee.
Yeah.
And the stock committee says, cool. The stock committee can say, cool, but that's not the end.
Yeah.
It goes to the national council next. And the national council has to say, cool.
So the negotiating team comes back, they go to the committee says, this is okay with us. It's sent to the national council. The cost contract is a national contract because it exists in all 3 of our union's regions. So the national council looks at it, and the national council, the 83 members of the national council, on behalf of the members of the union, their elected representatives, the council says, this is good with us. And that's how we ratify it from our side.
Yes.
Okay. So that's one way to do it. Are there contracts that we have that the members themselves get to ratify?
Yes, we have 2 that are constitutionally required.
Okay.
Or by law required.
Okay.
I'll have to figure out where that is.
Certainly required by our rules, and it's always the way we've done them. And there, you said there's 2 of them?
Yes.
The 2 are?
LORT.
Yes.
And the production contract.
LORT and the production contract. Up until ratification is the process for production. Have you negotiated? Have you been on a production contract team?
Not yet.
Okay. So I think the process is pretty much the same. We have our proposals, they have theirs. We go to the table. Good faith bargaining is required. I think when it comes to the production contract, we probably have slightly different goals for all sorts of reasons than we would for something as specific as stock contracts. But we bargain, we come to a tentative agreement, we shake, that's my shaking hands at the table thing. And then it's time for ratification. So it's not the same process as cost where it ends up going to the national council. Is it the entire membership that votes to ratify the production contract?
Well, it does go to the national council.
Oh, it does. That's correct. You're correct. It does. So it goes to the national council, and the national council, if the national council were to say, we don't like this, we don't approve of this, it would be game over. We have to go back to the table.
Right. The national council has the ability to say, please go back to the table for whatever reason.
Okay. So it doesn't just go straight from tentative agreement to the members. It goes to the national council. I should remember this because I voted on that a couple of times. The national council votes whether or not to recommend it for ratification to the members who will be voting to ratify. Yep. And then who among the membership votes on ratifying the production contract?
Those in our membership who have worked the contract within a certain amount of time.
So it goes out to members who have worked on the contract. They vote, they are sent terms of what we were able to achieve, what will be different. They vote yes or no. And then if the members vote yes, then we have an agreement. The employers have their own process on their end. I don't know, in my history at Equity, I don't know of the employers ever reaching tentative agreement and then saying, our member theaters said no to this tentative agreement, so we have to come back to the table.
I don't know if that ever happening either, but it's always a threat at the table.
I assume it's always a threat. Yeah. But that's actually that. Okay. So that's a really good segue. So right now we're talking about cost versus production. 2 processes that are basically the same, except for the ways in which they're ratified. What do you see, if any, advantages to a ratification process that ends at the National Council? The National Council, on behalf of the members, says this contract is good or this contract is bad.
Other than expediency and efficiency, not too many.
No other advantages that you can think of? I mean, I'm not saying I can think of any. I'm just
I
wondering.
don't know if I can think of any others. No.
Okay. So cost and expediency and efficiency, those are real things. Benefits to member ratifications, and specifically, again, we're not talking about all members, but members who have worked on that contract within the last number of cycles. Benefits there.
Tons of benefits. I mean, we get to directly hear from the people that we represent.
Mm-hmm.
And I say we as in I sit on the National Council, so I represent all 52,000 some members.
He does.
Or at least I try to.
He tries to. He does. He's great.
We get to hear from them specifically. So their yes or no vote isn't coming through me, it is actually coming from them.
Sure.
So we get to see, and there's an educational portion that happens because every single member who has worked that contract gets to see, this was my old contract, this was my new contract, and this is the thing that I'm going to either soon be working on or maybe never work on again, but I understand that there's a change happening.
Yeah. I will also say, when you are at the bargaining table, when you have a member ratification that has to pass, I think it allows a tremendous ability to play good cop, bad cop with your members. If you know you've got member ratification as a further step behind you, the ability to say, hey, employer, I want to give this to you. I think it's reasonable, but our members, they will never say yes to that. Like, have you met them? They're crazy. They're crazy. They're crazy out there. So I don't want us to go through the process of getting a tentative agreement and they're not going to say yes. And then we're going to have to come back here. You have to fly all the way back in from your cost theaters, wherever they are. And we're going to have to do this whole thing again. So why don't you just give us a thing that we want and back off of your proposal? I think, especially when you recognize the leverage and the power that an additional step from the members gives you, there are lots of ways to leverage that, which also I think then requires a willingness. You have to sort of also be willing in that process to get to a point where maybe you come to a tentative agreement that you know that your members aren't going to like, and that you tell your members, this is what we were able to come to at the table, your turn to vote, up to you. And this is, I think, a big reason why you see member ratification being the primary form of ratification across the labor movement. And especially now in this sort of new era of organizing and unionizing, which is so exciting, you see tentative agreements being reached and the members saying, no, absolutely not, go back. And union leadership not seeing that as a vice, but as a virtue, as a power tool of coming back to the table and being like, sorry, got to do better. So the production contract requires member ratification. You said the LORT contract also does, and LORT is our agreement with the League of Resident Theaters, but those are the only ones.
Right.
Those are the only ones. Okay. Everything else is done via a vote of the National Council, or who else? Who else is, because there are some that aren't just the National Council, right?
Regional boards can do it also. Yeah, so you could have CAT, which is in the Central Region.
The Chicago Area Theater Agreement, okay.
BAT, which is in the Western Region.
Yes, the Bay Area Theater Agreement. We have lots of AT contracts. We have, how many, so we've got CAT, BAT, HAT, the Hollywood Area Theater Agreement. That would also be handled by the Western Regional Board. NEAT, which is NEAT, the New England Area Theater Agreement. So that's in the Boston area. So that's also the Eastern Regional Board. OAT, the Orlando Area Theater Agreement. So also handled by the Regional Board. We have other ATs. There's got to be BAT, CAT, HAT, NEAT, OAT.
That might be it.
That might be it. Yeah. That might be it.
But that's a lot.
That's true. All right. So the council can vote to ratify on behalf of the members. A regional board can vote to ratify on behalf of the National Council, on behalf of members. Who else can ratify agreements?
Well, lots of people.
Yeah.
It can get as small as a single chair of a committee. It can get to the chair with their vice chairs.
Yeah.
It can be the chair bringing it to the committee.
Yeah.
And the committee does it.
Okay. So right now, I think that covers all of it. So right now we know a CBA. So that's an agreement between the union and an employer or a group of employers that includes a recognition clause, a full union agreement in which everybody is bound to bargain with each other in good faith. There are different CBAs that Equity has that can be ratified by the members or a group of members who have worked on a contract for a certain number of cycles, the National Council, the regional boards, a full committee, the chair and vice chairs of a committee, or the individual chair of a committee. In different circumstances, all of those different people have the ability to agree to those terms. Okay. Let's talk about processes by which we get to a CBA that are not like cost and production.
Great.
So what's a good example of a CBA that doesn't use that process at all?
That could be one that is negotiated by staff only.
Okay.
Or one that is promulgated.
the big scary word, promulgated. Well, let's do staff only. I, for a long time, have been a member of the Eastern Developing Theater Committee. Most of the work that we do as committee members in the Eastern Developing Theater Committee is ratifying agreements. More often than not, they are what we call letters of agreement, LOA contracts. This is a very wonky thing, and we're going to simplify the complicated. So there are a number of individual employers that will negotiate with the union on a one-on-one basis. They're not a member of a multi-employer group. They just come and they negotiate with the union individually. And really, I think as a means of efficiency, Equity will say, we have a collective bargaining agreement that we have reached with a group of employers over here, and its terms are probably reasonable for you to use. Theaters that use a letter of agreement based on one of those pre-existing CBAs, their salaries are almost always going to be lower than the terms in that CBA. So a very common one is a letter of agreement referenced to the LORT agreement. We do a lot of those in the Eastern region. We have historically. So we will enter into negotiations with an individual employer and say, you know, the LORT contract could generally work for you. We're going to make it not quite as nice for you in some ways. We're going to make it nicer for you in very specific ways, and specifically how much you have to pay people. But we're generally using the broad shell of a pre-existing contract like LORT, or sometimes cost, or sometimes coursed, and using that as a template and a starting place for negotiations with an individual employer. That kind of agreement is negotiated by a staff member.
Yes.
Typically by a business representative or a senior business representative. They will be on the phone with a representative of the employer. They will hammer out terms, and the staff member and the employer will come to the tentative agreement. And I'm always doing this handshaking. I'm doing this handshaking. And then it will be sent generally to a committee. If it is a letter of agreement reference to cost or coursed or LORT or whatever it is, whatever region that theater is in, it will be sent to that region's developing theater committee. And as we use the term developing theater, it basically just means a theater that's not a member of a multi-employer group. It essentially just means independent theater. And then it will be up to the members of the committee, the full committee, and that essentially means whoever shows up that day, to decide to ratify or not. Now, as you mentioned, it doesn't always make it to the full committee. Sometimes because of scheduling, God knows because of COVID, we haven't been having committee meetings as often. Sometimes it will be sent to just the chair and vice chairs of the committee, all of whom are
counselors.
Counselors, yes. Or in the central region, they might be non-counselors, central regional board members, yes. But yeah, so sometimes, again, for efficiency and expediency, sometimes it won't be sent to the entire committee. It'll be sent to the chair and the vice chairs, and they are empowered on behalf of the National Council, on behalf of the members, to ratify. And sometimes in hopefully limited circumstances, although sometimes it's not as limited as you might like, the individual chair of the committee can make that decision themselves. Again, this is not a direct member ratification. It's a ratification by a smaller group of members on behalf of the larger group. And in those cases, for instance, LOAs, those are negotiated by a staff member specifically, and then ratified by a smaller group of members. You used the scary word promulgated.
Before we go to promulgated,
Yeah.
we missed one.
What we miss?
We missed agreements of individual theaters that use the shell of other theaters, so individually negotiated theaters for certain contracts.
Independent users of CBAs. You want to take that one?
Sure. So we have the collective bargaining agreement. We'll go back to cost.
Mhm.
There's a bunch of theaters that are at the table who use that agreement.
Members of cost.
They're actual members of cost.
Yes.
Then there are theaters that are users of the cost agreement, which means they're not in the cost bargaining group.
Have you ever worked for an employer that's an individual user of a collective bargaining agreement?
I don't think so. I've worked on an LOA.
Okay, I've worked on an LOA too. Yeah.
But I don't think I've worked on an independent user. Yes.
Gotcha. I've worked once, I believe, on a LORT contract with a non-LORT employer. I'm going to give you some opinion right now. I'm going to tell you, this is a way in which I think the way we do things at Equity is very much outside of sort of the norms and standards of the labor movement. We talked about the reason for collectivizing, either as a worker or as an employer, is to gain leverage, is to gain power. When we sit across a table from a group of employers, we know that they have more power than they would if we were dealing with them individually. It has always struck me as odd that after a negotiation, say with the League of Resident Theaters, a major multi-employer group with a lot of muscle, with whom we have to fight to get the things that we want, and we always walk away from the table not having gotten everything that we want. That's just the nature of collective bargaining. The existence of a CBA shouldn't be taken to mean Equity thinks this contract is perfect, but rather this is what we were able to achieve with the people across the table from us. To then take that finished product and hand it to an individual employer without any of the strength of a multi-employer group and say, how do these terms look to you? And use that as a starting point for negotiations, to me has always seemed strange. At least with an LOA process, you are doing some of that unsweetening of the deal. You're saying there are some things that this multi-employer group was able to achieve that we're not going to give to you. We're just not. With an independent user of LORT, like on the theater that I worked for, there were no differences between the LORT agreement and what they were doing. They just essentially had been handed the LORT agreement and they said, thumbs up, good to go. And so it was, I think it was a LORT C or maybe a B, I can't remember, but they were using the terms as if they were as if they had the power of sitting at that table. And with LORT, there are, at least a dozen independent users of LORT to whom we just give those terms.
It's really important to say again that the contract that we receive is an eroded version of the perfect thing that we wanted.
Yeah.
So what we're doing is we are giving an eroded contract to someone else and saying you are able to negotiate it and erode it even more.
Yeah. So this is, I think, a really good segue into promulgation. And promulgation, I talk about it as being scary because it's, I think, one of the least well understood concepts. Promulgated contract. So let's use my favorite example of a promulgated contract, and one I think, especially to our members all across the country, will be very familiar. It's the SPT, yes, the Small Professional Theater Agreement. That is promulgated. So how does a promulgated contract come into existence and how does it get improved? What's the process?
Oh man, do I actually know this? It's just like DevT though, right?
It is. Well, it's, yeah. Remember, are you on the Development Theater Committee?
I was, and then I left.
You was, and then you, right, which is why I remember you in those meetings, but then you weren't. And I don't even know if you ever went through a promulgation process with us in SPT.
No, I was only there because I was mad about working at an LOA. So I joined the DevT committee because that's what they used to tell us at Equity, right? You're mad about something, join the committee. And I was like, wait a minute, I'm not getting anything done. So I left the committee. But also, ding, ding, ding. Remember, we have another way for you to participate. Go back to episode 1.
It's always so funny because we both have served on so many committees. It's very easy to just always be like, yeah, you're on that committee with me. You've gone through that process. Okay, so promulgation, really simply put, rather than the union putting together proposals and employers putting together proposals and then going to the table and coming to terms, Equity unilaterally writes a rule book. Now, the SPT rule book has been around for a very long time. It's many, many pages long. It's probably somewhere between like 80 and 130 pages. But Equity wrote it unilaterally. We write that rule book. And every time it comes up for expiration, we just continue writing it. We, starting in the developing theater committees, and I know there's some committee restructuring going on with this, but historically, we have a developing theater committee in each of the 3 regions. They all work together to come up with ways in which we think the rule book of SPT could be better. And then when we're done with that process, we sort of put it out into the world and we say, this is the SPT agreement. And then there are hundreds of theaters across the country that use the terms of SPT. As we read from the NLRB website, an employer is required to bargain in good faith. A union is required to bargain in good faith. Whether it is a promulgated rule book that we've written ourselves, whether it is the terms of a CBA that we reached with another employer, whether it is an LOA type deal where we've changed some things of an existing CBA and we've changed other things of the existing CBA. The union can never unilaterally say to an employer with which it has a CBA, these are the terms. Can't do it. It is always a subject of bargaining. We can always ask for things. They can always ask for things. When you talk about a promulgated agreement, what you are essentially promulgating is a starting place for negotiations. It is a unified sort of, this is what we expect from you. I would say salary is a different thing, but in terms of like the rest of the rule book, I would say the vast majority of employers accept the SPT as is. And I think that's very smart for employers to do, because the moment that they don't, they then open themselves up to good faith bargaining that they can enter into, but then they have to receive responses from us. I think especially with SPTs, which tend to be smaller employers, although that's not always the case, they're generally going to be better off acceding to the terms and then spending whatever negotiating capital they have on the salary terms, and very specifically the ratio terms, the non-pro ratio terms, because there are no specific ratio terms laid out in SPT at all. That is entirely at the discretion of the staff member to negotiate and then send for ratification. So,
my goodness,
that's a lot. We've talked about multi-employer agreements that go through a traditional bargaining process that go to the council for a recommendation to the membership, and then the members directly ratify. We've talked about a similar process, but that then goes to the national council or regional board for ratification without going directly to the members. We've talked about individual users of CBAs that already exist, or letter of agreements that are referenced to existing CBAs that are a bit different, that are subject to good faith negotiation on both sides, and then go for ratification, typically to a smaller group of members. And we've talked about promulgated agreements that the union writes out of whole cloth, but then are really a starting point for good faith negotiations, which usually are just about salary terms and ratio terms, and then get ratified again by smaller groups. Is there anything that we've missed?
Well, I think the thing that we missed is the part about, all right, so now you're working it. The easiest thing to do is just go to the member portal, go to the on the job, click down, and I think it says rule book library.
I'm pulling it up right now. We're logging into the member portal.
Awesome.
We're going to the menu, on the job. You nailed it. Rule books library.
Awesome.
There it is.
They're listed are all of them. In that way, I say read your rule book before you work the contract.
Always remember, the terms of a CBA are minimums. And that's not just about salary. It's about everything. It's about benefits and working conditions. Just about everything you can negotiate up. The CBA says you can't go below any of these things. You can ask for more. And as I always like to say, always ask for more. Always. And at some point, again, I think this is probably for a different episode, we will also talk about the contractual instruments that exist for equity members to work for employers that are not CBAs. As we've defined it, an equity theater, what we call an equity theater, is a theater that has entered into a binding collective bargaining agreement with the union with a recognition clause. They have said, your union represents the workers and we are bound to a relationship with you. We have a number of different kinds of contractual instruments that allow our members to work for non-equity theaters. And the way in which we reach those are different. And then the union's relationship to those employers is different. The members' relationship to those employers are different. You are still an employee. You are still protected by the union. The union would never allow you to work on a contract that did not come with the full protections and their full support behind you. So that's a lot of information that we've covered today. You can feel the sun is beginning to set from my big open windows. Anything else we need to cover? That's a lot.
So we will do another episode on concessions.
We will do another episode on concessions. Boy, there's like dangling the sequel right there. We will talk about concessions and how they jibe with ratification and maybe sometimes not, but that's a story for a different day. So you think we're good to go?
I am.
All right. Well, thank you again for joining us for another episode of Wonky Weekly. I'm Sid Solomon.
I'm Rashaan James II.
And I'm going to come up with a better intro phrase for next time. I will. I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it. It's going to happen. He has no faith in me. All right. Bye.